Have you ever wondered what a single act of kindness could reveal about your past? A little girl offered her only treasure to feed her brother. She had no idea the stranger she stopped was her real father. Ethan Carter never expected a single morning walk to change everything he thought he knew about his life. That day had started like hundreds before it, with the city humming around him and his mind already occupied with numbers, meetings, and the endless pursuit of achievement. He stepped out of his car in front of the towering glass office building where he had spent the last decade climbing higher and higher until there was almost no one left above him. His light blue suit was pressed to perfection, his brown hair carefully combed back, and his blue eyes, usually so calm and unreadable, were fixed on the notification streaming across his phone. But as he walked along the sidewalk toward the revolving door, something made him look up. Two children were standing in his path, blocking the flow of hurried pedestrians without seeming to notice or care. What if this moment changed everything for you too? The older one, a girl maybe 6 or 7 years old, had long brown hair that was slightly tangled at the ends and wore a faded yellow t-shirt tucked into a blue denim skirt. She was barefoot, though it was still cool enough outside that he felt an instinctive urge to take off his own jacket and wrap it around her shoulders. She held the hand of a much smaller boy, perhaps 4 years old, with fine blonde hair and wide blue eyes that reminded Ethan of the pale color of a winter sky. His jeans were too short, and the hem was fraying where it brushed the ground. They were out of place here, so small and solemn against the polished facade of his corporate world. He slowed his steps as the girl lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without fear, only a tired sort of determination. Then she stepped forward and carefully opened her small palm, revealing something that gleamed gold in the morning light. "Sir," she said in a voice that was so steady it made his chest ache, "this is all we have. My brother is hungry." For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. He stared at the bracelet in her hand, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was the bracelet, the one he had given Lily Brooks 7 years ago, on the last night they'd ever spent together. He remembered the way her eyes had shone when she'd fastened it around her wrist, the way she'd whispered that she would never take it off. After she disappeared, he told himself she must have pawned it, traded it for train fare to wherever she had run. He had tried not to think about it again. But here it was, resting in the hand of a child whose eyes mirrored his own so perfectly it made something in his chest twist and tighten. He took the bracelet carefully, as if it might vanish if he touched it too quickly, and turned it over until the engraving caught the light. "Time can never part us," he swallowed, struggling to keep his voice even. "What's your name?" he asked the girl softly. "Emily," she answered. "And this is Oliver?" He nodded slowly, trying to process everything at once. If this bracelet was here, if this little girl with his eyes and Lily's mouth was standing in front of him, then everything he thought he buried was coming back to the surface. "Where is your mother?" he asked, though he already knew the answer before the words left her lips. "In the hospital," Emily said. Her voice stayed steady, but her hand closed around her brother's. "She's sleeping. They said she might not wake up. We don't have anywhere to go." Ethan looked past her to the people flowing around them. Not one person stopping to ask why two children were offering a gold bracelet to a stranger in a suit. He felt a quiet, cold shame for all the times he'd done exactly the same. Kept walking, kept ignoring, kept pretending that pain like this didn't exist. He drew in a long breath and held the bracelet tight in his hand. He had no plan, no script, no idea how to start fixing the cracks that were already splintering across the surface of the life he'd so carefully constructed. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty as he looked into Emily's blue eyes. He wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. Ethan led them away from the office building before anyone could stop to gawk or ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. He felt the stares on his back anyway, but for once he didn't care. Emily walked beside him, her small hand still gripping her brother's wrist as if she were afraid he might slip away if she let go for even a second. Oliver moved with the resigned obedience of a child who had learned not to cry when he was tired or hungry. That quiet acceptance did something to Ethan that he hadn't expected. It hurt in a way he didn't have words for. They turned the corner and stepped into the warm interior of a small cafe tucked between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy. The space was bright and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. It was the sort of unassuming place he'd passed 100 times without ever noticing. Today, it felt like a safe harbor. He guided the children to a corner table near the window and helped them climb into the booth. Emily immediately shifted so Oliver could lean against her shoulder. She looked up at Ethan without speaking, waiting for permission to do anything next. "It's okay," he said quietly, trying to make his voice softer than he felt inside. "You can sit. You don't have to give me anything else." Her shoulders relaxed just enough that he realized how tense she had been. He gestured to the laminated menu, though he doubted she could read all of it. "Are you hungry?" Emily nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then lowered her gaze to the tabletop. A waitress approached, giving Ethan a curious glance, but he ignored it. He ordered pancakes, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, a pot of tea, and orange juice, then added a plate of fruit he wasn't sure they'd touch, but wanted them to have anyway. As soon as she left, he looked back at Emily and Oliver. Up close, they were even smaller than they'd seemed outside. Both of them had the brittle look of children who'd been underfed too long. Their clothes were clean, but worn almost translucent in places. When the food arrived, neither child moved at first. Emily glanced at Ethan again as though she expected him to take it away or demand something in return. He shook his head. "Go ahead. Eat as much as you want." For a few seconds, she hesitated, then picked up a piece of toast and handed it to her brother before taking one for herself. Watching them eat, watching them try not to wolf everything down in a single mouthful, was almost more than he could stand. He wanted to ask more questions, but he was afraid to overwhelm them. So instead, he simply sat there, keeping his expression calm, while inside a storm gathered. 7 years. 7 years since Lily had vanished. He had spent months searching before giving up, telling himself she must have made her choice, telling himself that moving on was the only sane thing to do. But now the truth was sitting across from him, small and hungry and impossibly familiar. When the children had eaten enough to slow their frantic movements, Ethan finally cleared his throat. "Emily," he began, keeping his voice as gentle as he could, "can you tell me a little more about your mom? About what happened?" She swallowed, looking down at her folded hands. She was working at a hotel, cleaning rooms. One day, she didn't come home. The lady there said she fell and hit her head. The ambulance took her away. We waited, but no one came. He tried to keep his hands steady as he reached for his coffee. "And since then?" Emily glanced at Oliver, who had begun to drift against her side, drowsy from a full stomach. "We stayed in the place where she worked until they told us we couldn't be there anymore." "Where have you been sleeping?" he asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "Mostly behind buildings. Sometimes the nice lady in the store let us stay in the stockroom just for a night." She spoke in a matter-of-fact tone that made something tighten in his chest. Children shouldn't know how to survive like that. They should never have to. He took a slow breath. "Do you remember where the hospital is?" She nodded. "It's big. Lots of glass. They don't let us stay long." Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "Emily, the bracelet you tried to give me. Do you know where your mom got it?" She looked up at him finally, her eyes clear and open. "She said it was from someone she loved. A long time ago." His throat constricted, but he forced himself to nod. "Thank you for telling me." When the check came, he paid without thinking and then stood. He held out his hand, and after a brief pause, Emily slipped her smaller one into his. Oliver roused himself enough to follow. Ethan knew this was only the beginning, that the hardest conversations were still ahead, but he also knew he could not let them go back to the street. Outside the city moved around them, loud and indifferent. But he felt none of that now. He looked down at the children, this little girl who might be his daughter, this boy who had no one, and he realized he had already decided. Whatever happened next, he was going to stay. Ethan decided not to take them back to his office. Not yet. It felt too sterile, too sharp around the edges for two children who looked like they hadn't slept indoors in weeks. Instead, he called his driver and gave him an address for a hotel he knew just a few blocks away. It wasn't the most extravagant place in Manhattan, but it was warm and private, the kind of space where no one would question why a man in a tailored suit was arriving with 2 children in second-hand clothes. As they walked, Emily held Oliver's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't look around much, and he realized it was because she was afraid to let herself be distracted in case something bad happened. That kind of vigilance belonged to someone far older than 7. The hotel lobby was calm, filled with the gentle hush of music and the occasional clink of cups in the cafe corner. He approached the desk and quietly arranged for a 2-bedroom suite with a kitchenette, giving the manager his credit card and a look that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for questions. While the paperwork was completed, he led the children to a sofa by the window, where they sat side by side, Oliver leaning against Emily's arm, his eyes half shut with exhaustion. Ethan crouched down so he was at their eye level. "I need a little time to make sure everything is ready," he told them, "but after that, you're going to have a place to rest." "A safe place." Emily nodded, but her eyes didn't quite relax. It struck him that she was waiting for the moment when all this would be snatched away. He wanted to tell her she could trust him, but he knew words were cheap when your world had taught you better than to believe promises. When the suite was ready, the manager personally escorted them upstairs. The space was bigger than Ethan's own first apartment, 2 bedrooms, a small living area with a sofa and television, and a clean kitchen stocked with tea and bottled water. The windows overlooked a quiet courtyard, and the air smelled faintly of fresh linen. Emily stepped inside first, her hands still gripping her brother's. She turned in a slow circle as if she was afraid the room would vanish if she looked away too quickly. Oliver said nothing, but wandered over to the bed closest to the window and climbed onto it. He didn't bounce or play. He simply curled on his side and pulled his knees to his chest as if that was the safest position he knew. Ethan thanked the manager and closed the door behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, his hand still on the handle. He felt the full weight of what he was doing settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't a temporary kindness. This was the beginning of something that would change every part of his life, whether he was ready or not. He walked to the kitchenette, filled 2 glasses of water, and set them on the low table. Emily approached slowly, her eyes searching his face. "Do we have to leave in the morning?" she asked in a voice so soft it almost disappeared. "No," he said without hesitation, "you can stay as long as you need to. And your mom, I'm going to find a way to help her, too." He meant every word, but he also knew he was in uncharted territory. He'd never been responsible for anyone but himself. He'd never had to think about whether a frightened child needed to hear reassurance more than facts. But as he looked at her thin shoulders, her tangled hair, and those eyes so much like his own, he knew he would figure it out. Later that afternoon, after they'd eaten sandwiches from room service, and Oliver had fallen asleep again, Ethan sat across from Emily at the little round dining table. He pulled the bracelet from his pocket and set it gently in front of her. She looked at it without touching it, her expression solemn. "Did your mother ever talk about me?" he asked carefully. She hesitated. She said she loved someone a long time ago, but she couldn't find him. She said she wished he knew about me. His throat tightened. "I think she was talking about me." Emily didn't say anything. She just looked at him, studying his face as if she could read the truth there. He didn't try to fill the silence. She deserved time to process what he just implied. After a while, she reached out and picked up the bracelet, cradling it in her palm. "If you were the one, does that mean you're my dad?" He felt something in his chest crack and fall away. It was the last of the walls he'd built around his heart to keep from feeling too much. "Yes," he said simply, "I think I am." She nodded like she'd suspected all along. Then she slipped the bracelet back into his hand and whispered, "Then you should keep this." He didn't try to stop the tears that blurred his vision. He just closed his hand around the bracelet and promised her that he would never disappear again. The next morning, Ethan woke up in the small armchair near the window, feeling a stiffness in his back that reminded him he hadn't slept anywhere but his own immaculate bed in years. But he didn't regret staying. In the early dawnlight, he could see Emily asleep on one of the twin beds, curled protectively around Oliver, her arm draped over his chest like she was afraid someone would come and take him if she let go. He watched them for a moment, taking in how peaceful they looked when they didn't have to be brave. He wondered how many nights she had stayed awake, listening for footsteps or waiting for her brother to start crying in the dark. He felt the old familiar ache of guilt he couldn't even fully name. All he knew was that if he'd been braver, if he hadn't given up searching when Lily disappeared, these children might never have learned to feel that kind of fear. He stepped quietly into the kitchenette to make tea. He didn't want to wake them, but he needed to collect himself before the day began. He had made a dozen calls the night before to lawyers, hospital administrators, and social workers. He was determined to secure guardianship and make sure Lily's care was fully funded. The system was already suspicious of a man suddenly appearing, claiming responsibility for children he had never met. But Ethan was prepared to spend every dollar he had convincing them this was no passing impulse. He would prove he meant to stay no matter how long it took. Around 7, Emily stirred, sitting up slowly, her hair falling into her face. She rubbed her eyes and blinked at the brightening window. When she spotted Ethan at the counter, her shoulders eased and she managed a shy, sleepy smile. He set the mug down and came over, crouching next to the bed. "Morning," he said gently. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded, her voice rough with sleep. "It's warm here." "I'm glad," he said. "I was thinking maybe today we could go see your mom if you feel ready." Her expression shifted, something cautious and sad flickering behind her eyes. "Will she know us?" He swallowed, wishing he had better answers. "I don't know yet, but I think she'll be happy you came." Oliver woke up next, disoriented for a moment until he recognized Emily beside him. Then he relaxed, pressing closer to her. Ethan felt a twist of sorrow and relief at how much the little boy depended on his sister for every scrap of safety he had left. They ate breakfast together. Simple things from room service: oatmeal, toast, warm milk. Emily insisted on buttering Oliver's toast herself, her small hands careful and precise. Ethan watched them, struck by how these ordinary gestures felt so monumental. When they were finished, he helped them get dressed in the new clothes he'd bought the night before. Emily studied the tags for a long time, as if she couldn't quite believe they belonged to her now. When he knelt to tie Oliver's shoes, the boy laid one hand on his shoulder to steady himself, and the trust in that tiny touch nearly undid him. By mid-morning, they were in a cab headed to the hospital. Emily sat stiffly beside him, her hand clutching the bracelet again. She hadn't let it out of her sight since the night before. As they pulled up to the wide glass entrance, she drew in a shaky breath. "If she doesn't wake up, does that mean she won't come back?" Ethan rested his palm over hers. "Sometimes people in a coma wake up when they hear voices they love. We can tell her you're here. We can talk to her. And I promise you, no matter what happens, you won't be alone." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. He thought maybe she was testing whether he would flinch from her grief. He didn't. Inside, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and something sadder he couldn't quite define. A nurse guided them to Lily's room. When they stepped inside, Emily stopped so abruptly that Ethan nearly bumped into her. Her breath came in short, careful hitches as she took in the tubes, the machines, the pale stillness of her mother's face. Oliver didn't understand. He pulled away from Emily and tried to climb onto the bed, calling "Mama," in a small, hopeful voice that made Ethan's chest ache. Emily went to him, lifting him carefully into her lap in the visitor's chair. She held him against her heart, rocking slightly, her eyes fixed on Lily. Ethan stood beside them, unsure for the first time in years how to be useful. All he could do was be present. He reached for Lily's limp hand and held it gently. She was still warm, still here, and for the first time since he'd learned the truth, he felt certain she would come back to them. He looked down at Emily, who had finally turned her face up to meet his gaze. "Can we talk to her now?" she whispered. He nodded. "Yes, I think she'd like that." So Emily began in her clear, trembling voice, telling her mother everything she'd missed. She described the cafe and the hotel, how Oliver liked the soft bed, how she wasn't scared when Ethan was with them. She talked about the bracelet and how she had kept it safe. And while she spoke, Ethan realized that this was the moment he'd been most afraid of because it was the moment he could no longer pretend this was temporary. This was his family. These were his children, and Lily was the only person who could help him learn how to be what they needed. Ethan didn't know how long they stayed in Lily's hospital room that day. Time seemed to lose its usual sharpness, blurring into a slow stream of quiet voices and the steady pulse of the monitors. Emily never stopped talking for long. When she tired, she would rest her cheek on Oliver's head, gathering herself before starting again. Sometimes she just whispered that she missed her mother, that she was sorry for ever making things harder. Ethan wanted to tell her she had nothing to be sorry for, but he understood that some guilt lived so deep it needed to be spoken aloud before it could loosen its hold. He took the chair on the other side of the bed, holding Lily's free hand in both of his. He studied her face, the faint creases at the corners of her mouth, the dark lashes lying still against her cheeks. In the past, he had thought of her disappearance as an abandonment, a choice she'd made to hurt him or to escape. But now, with her body so still and fragile in front of him, he realized how little he had ever understood about her life. He hadn't known she'd been pregnant. He hadn't known she'd had nowhere to go. He hadn't known what it would cost her to carry on alone. When visiting hours ended, a nurse came to the doorway and gave Ethan an apologetic look. Emily stood and kissed her mother's cheek, pressing the bracelet against Lily's palm. "I'll bring it again tomorrow," she whispered. She helped Oliver down and took his hand, looking back only once before following the nurse into the hall. Ethan waited until the door closed behind them. He stayed another moment, studying Lily's face, searching for any sign that she felt him there. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough in the quiet, "for not trying harder to find you. For not knowing. I'm going to make it right if I can." He returned to the hotel with the children and did his best to make the evening feel normal. He ordered takeout, spaghetti and meatballs, which Oliver picked at, and which Emily tried to eat politely, though her eyes kept drifting to the window. They watched a movie afterward, something animated with bright colors and cheerful songs, but even the characters' relentless happiness couldn't fully distract them. When the credits rolled, Emily crawled onto the couch beside Ethan and rested her head against his arm. "Is she going to die?" she asked in a voice so small he almost pretended he hadn't heard it. He smoothed her hair away from her face, feeling her tremble under his palm. "I don't know," he admitted, "because she deserved honesty, but she's still fighting. And no matter what happens, you'll never be alone again." That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Ethan sat by the window in the dark. He watched the glow of street lights on the glass and tried to imagine the life he'd thought he wanted before this began. He remembered the nights he had worked late at the office, convincing himself that success would make the loneliness worthwhile. He told himself that love was something that came second to ambition, that building his empire would fill the hollow space in his chest. But now, with the memory of Emily's voice in his ears and the shape of Oliver's small hand still lingering on his skin, he saw how wrong he'd been. These children didn't care about his business, his reputation, or his wealth. They cared about whether he was there when they woke up, whether they had food to eat, a safe place to sleep, and someone to say goodnight. And he found, to his surprise, that he wanted nothing more than to give them all those things. The next day, he met with his lawyer in the small business center off the hotel lobby. The man, a precise and discreet professional who had handled everything from mergers to real estate, listened carefully as Ethan explained the situation. He didn't flinch when Ethan said he believed Emily was his daughter and that he intended to pursue guardianship for both children regardless. "We'll start with an emergency custody petition," the lawyer said, tapping his tablet. "Given their circumstances and your paternity claim, the court is likely to approve temporary placement. But you understand this will be public at some point. There will be questions." Ethan nodded, feeling a calm he hadn't expected. "Let them ask. The only thing that matters now is that those kids don't go back to the street." When he returned upstairs, Emily was sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons spread around her. She looked up, her blue eyes searching his face. "Did you find out something?" she asked. "Yes," he said as he crouched beside her, "we're going to make sure you and your brother stay with me. No one is taking you away." She didn't smile right away. She studied him as though testing whether he meant it. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and hugged him, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. He closed his eyes and wrapped his arms around her, feeling the small certain weight of trust settling between them. It was more precious than any contract he had ever signed. And he knew in that moment that no matter how complicated the road ahead would be, he was never going back to the life he'd led before he met them. By the end of that week, Ethan had begun to see that the rhythm of caring for children was as relentless as any boardroom negotiation, only more demanding in ways he hadn't been able to imagine. He found himself waking before dawn to the soft sounds of Oliver crying out in his sleep. He learned how to coax him back to calm without startling him, how to lift him gently back onto the pillow without making the boy feel like he was being moved just to be quiet. He discovered that Emily didn't fall asleep until she had checked the door twice, confirming it was locked and that Ethan was still nearby. At first, he tried to reassure her with words, but he came to realize that the only thing she believed was consistency. So, he showed up every evening without fail, so she would know he meant it when he said he wasn't going anywhere. Mornings became a small ritual he hadn't known he needed. They would gather around the little table in the suite with bowls of cereal and warm toast. Emily always prepared Oliver's plate first, laying everything out exactly the same way. She never asked Ethan to help, but she also didn't object when he poured the milk or buttered the toast she set aside for herself. It was a delicate dance of learning to share the work of care. After breakfast, he would walk them downstairs to the car, where his driver waited to take them to a small children's center he had arranged for the day. The center was cheerful and bright, filled with other children and a staff who never looked twice at their second-hand clothes or their hesitant voices. Each morning when he watched them step inside, he felt the same flicker of disbelief that he was the one bringing them there, that he was the person they looked back for before crossing the threshold. On Friday afternoon, when he returned to pick them up, the director of the center asked if she could speak to him privately. She was a kind woman with gentle hands and eyes that had seen far too much. She explained that Emily hadn't wanted to participate in the group art project because she was afraid that if she left Oliver's side, someone would take him away. When Ethan thanked her for telling him, she laid a hand lightly on his arm and said, "They trust you more than they trust anyone else. That's why she's starting to show you her fear." He drove them back to the hotel himself that evening, feeling the quiet weight of that observation. In the rear-view mirror, he saw Emily resting her head against Oliver's. He didn't need anyone to explain to him what it meant to be afraid of losing the only person you had left. He remembered the months after Lily disappeared when he had tried to bury himself in work, pretending he hadn't lost something irreplaceable. It struck him that Emily was doing the same thing now, holding her brother so tightly because it was the only way she could keep herself from unraveling. Back at the suite, he ordered dinner, something simple, roasted chicken and vegetables, and they ate together in the living area while the television played softly in the background. When the plates were cleared and Oliver was nodding off against a pillow, Ethan decided it was time to try something he'd been putting off. He picked up the bracelet from the table, turning it over in his hand. "Emily," he said, meeting her gaze across the sofa, "I think we should go see your mom again tomorrow, and I'd like to bring this back to her." Emily studied the bracelet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took it, closing her fingers around the delicate gold. "Do you think she'll wake up if she knows we're there?" she asked. "I think she'll hear you," he said honestly. "I think she already does." Later, when the children were asleep, he sat by the window in the dark, watching the city lights flicker between the curtains. He tried to picture what life might look like if Lily never woke up. He thought about how he would explain it to Emily and Oliver, how he would help them carry the loss without letting it swallow them. But in that same breath, he also allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if she did open her eyes and saw him there, saw the children safe and loved. He wondered if she would still see the man she had once trusted, or if too much time had passed to believe in that version of him. He fell asleep in the chair again, the bracelet resting in his palm. And before sleep finally claimed him, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel since the day he first saw Emily's face, a cautious, stubborn hope that maybe they could all find their way back to each other, no matter how far apart they drifted. The next morning dawned bright and clear with the kind of sharp autumn air that made everything feel a little cleaner and more honest. Ethan had woken early, not because of Oliver's cries this time, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was waiting for them. He dressed quietly, careful not to disturb the children, and stood for a long moment by the window, watching the city come alive below. He felt the bracelet in his pocket, the familiar weight of it grounding him in this reality he hadn't been prepared for, but was no longer afraid of. When he finally turned back to the room, Emily was already awake, sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed. Her hair was mussed from sleep, and she held her stuffed rabbit against her chest. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him with an expression that seemed older than her years. He sat beside her and waited, knowing she would speak when she was ready. After a moment, she said, "I had a dream that Mama came back." She was smiling. "She said you were here to help us." He swallowed, pressing a hand to the back of his neck. "I think she'd be glad we're together," he said honestly, "and I think she'd be proud of you for taking such good care of Oliver." Emily's gaze dropped to her lap. "I don't want to be the one who has to take care of him forever," she whispered. "I'm so tired." The admission was so raw and small that it hollowed out his chest. Without thinking, he reached for her hand and held it between both of his. "You shouldn't have to be," he told her, "that's why I'm here. You don't have to do this alone anymore." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away. That felt like something significant. After breakfast, he helped them into their coats, and they set out for the hospital. As they rode the elevator up to the ICU, Emily grew quieter. By the time they stepped into Lily's room, her shoulders were pulled tight with dread. But this time, Ethan didn't try to fill the silence. He simply walked to Lily's side, took her hand, and waited for Emily to decide when she was ready. Eventually, she stepped forward and climbed into the chair, setting her stuffed rabbit in her lap. She looked at her mother's face for a long time, her small hand resting lightly on the blanket. Then, in a trembling voice, she began to talk. She told Lily about the hotel, about the children's center, about the warm meals and the safe bed. She described the way Oliver had learned to fall asleep without crying. She talked about Ethan, about how he never left, how he kept coming back, how he promised not to let them be alone again. Ethan felt her words settle into the quiet room like tiny stitches, mending the invisible rips between the life they'd had and the life they were trying to build. After a while, Emily fell silent. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "Will you tell her too?" she asked. He swallowed and nodded. He hadn't planned to speak, but now that she'd asked, he felt there was nothing more important. He leaned closer to Lily, feeling Emily watching him as he searched for the right words. "Lily," he said softly, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here. Emily and Oliver are safe. I promise you they're going to stay safe. If you wake up, we'll figure everything out together. And if you can't, I'm going to take care of them. They'll always have a home." He didn't expect anything to change. But as he spoke, Lily's eyelashes fluttered. It was almost imperceptible, a tiny movement, so brief he thought he imagined it. He looked at Emily to see if she'd noticed, but she was still watching Lily's face. A moment later, Lily's fingers twitched in his palm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make his heart leap into his throat. Enough to know she was still fighting to come back to them. Emily gasped and clutched his arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. They waited, holding their breath, but Lily didn't move again. Even so, something had shifted. The room no longer felt like a place of only endings. It felt like it held the possibility of something beginning. After visiting hours ended, he walked the children back through the quiet hospital corridors. Emily didn't let go of his hand, and Oliver leaned sleepily against his side. When they reached the sidewalk, Ethan crouched so he could look them both in the eyes. "I know that was hard," he said, "but you were so brave and I'm proud of you." Emily searched his face for a long time. Then she threw her arms around his neck and hugged him as tightly as her small body could manage. When she let go, she said, "I believe you now." He blinked, feeling the words settle somewhere deep in his chest. "About what?" he asked. "That you're going to stay?" she whispered. He pressed a hand over his heart as he looked at her. And in that moment, he felt more certain than he ever had about any decision he'd made in his life. He was already exactly where he was meant to be. A week later, everything began to change in a way that felt almost too big for any of them to grasp at first. Ethan woke early again, the familiar ache in his back, reminding him he had slept in the chair by the window more nights than he could count. But today felt different, as if the air itself was charged with a kind of trembling possibility. He went through the quiet motions of morning, making tea, checking the children while they still slept, collecting the papers the lawyer had sent over the night before. By the time Emily stirred and sat up, rubbing her eyes, he had already dressed and packed a bag for the hospital visit. She didn't say anything as she came to stand by his side, her small hand slipping into his without hesitation. Oliver trailed behind her, thumb in his mouth, half asleep, but willing to follow wherever she went. They took the elevator down and stepped into the chilled morning, the city bustling in that ordinary way that always felt almost surreal when your own life was anything but ordinary. As the car moved through the traffic, Ethan found himself staring out the window, wondering what he would do if nothing changed. He tried to picture explaining it to Emily, telling her that sometimes love alone wasn't enough to bring someone back. He tried to imagine himself standing beside Lily's bed again, saying all the things he hadn't had the courage to say when they were together. He felt the weight of every failure, every missed chance, every day he had spent believing he was better off alone. But when they reached the hospital, he looked at the two children waiting patiently for him to lead, and he knew none of that mattered anymore. They walked the familiar corridor, and Emily's grip on his fingers tightened with each step. When they reached Lily's door, he paused to look down at her. "Are you ready?" he asked, though he knew no one was ever really ready for these moments. She nodded once, her chin lifting in that determined way that always reminded him of Lily herself. Inside, the room was hushed except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Lily's face was still pale, her hair spread across the pillow like a dark halo. Ethan set the small bag of clean clothes and flowers on the table and crossed to her side, feeling his heart thudding in his throat. Emily climbed into the chair and took her mother's hand the way she had every visit. She leaned close, her voice soft but clear as she began to talk about the night before, about the movie they watched, about how Oliver had laughed so hard milk came out of his nose. Ethan felt something shift, as if the air itself were bracing for what came next. He didn't even realize he was holding his breath until Lily's eyelids fluttered again. This time, they didn't stop. Slowly, with the halting uncertainty of a body waking from too long a sleep, her eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, blinking against the bright light. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as Lily's gaze drifted across the ceiling before finding her daughter's face. For one terrible second, no one moved. Then Lily's lips parted, her voice a ragged whisper. "Emily!" The girl made a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh, and threw her arms around her mother's neck, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes. Oliver began to cry without understanding exactly why, but Ethan knew it was because even at 4 years old, he could feel something momentous happening. He reached down and lifted the boy into his arms, holding him close while he watched Lily slowly raise a trembling hand to touch Emily's cheek. Tears streamed freely down Ethan's face, and he didn't bother to hide them. A nurse appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with surprise as she realized what was happening. She stepped inside to check Lily's vitals, quietly, assuring them it was all right to stay. Lily's eyes moved past Emily, searching the room until they landed on Ethan. For a moment, she just looked at him and he wondered if she would turn away, if she would blame him for not finding her sooner, for all the years they had lost. But instead, her mouth curved into the faintest, tired smile. "You came," she whispered. He swallowed, unable to find words, so he only nodded. Emily was still holding her mother's hand as if she'd never let go again. "We were waiting for you," she said, her voice fierce and shaking all at once. "He helped us. He found us." Lily's gaze never left Ethan's face. When she closed her eyes again, she didn't fall back into the deep, unreachable sleep they had feared. Her breathing was slow but steady. She was here. Really here. When the nurse finally urged them to give Lily time to rest, Ethan carried Oliver out of the room while Emily walked beside him. In the hall, she looked up at him with tear-reddened eyes and said, "I told you she'd come back." He smiled through the ache in his chest and touched her cheek gently. "Yes, you did." That night, back in the hotel suite, he tucked them both into bed and sat for a long time, watching their peaceful faces. He thought about all the ways his life had changed in a matter of weeks and about how much more it would change still. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid of it. He felt ready. When he finally turned off the lamp and lay down in the chair by the window, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for. The certainty that whatever happened next, none of them would ever have to face it alone again. Brought to you by Millionaire in Love.